All right, Chapter 9, Dealing with Biases. Unfortunately, this is a real topic. It's something we're going to have to spend just a little bit of time on so that you know what is out there, what you're facing. We're going to go briefly over the fact that bias does happen. And again, we want to be prepared for how to handle that. We'll talk about some of the different types of bias, like gender bias and racial bias, name bias even. Believe it or not, your name can cause someone to be biased towards you. And layout bias, meaning the layout of your resume. The layout of your resume can cause someone to react in a certain way. And I'm going to show you how we get around that. And then we're just going to do a brief summary of what we're dealing with here with bias. So bias happens. Yes, it does. Considering the enormous amount of information that hiring managers have to deal with, resumes, applications, test scores, notes, all this kind of stuff, maybe actual interviews that they're involved in. Recruiters are very likely to unconsciously evaluate and even categorize the, whether someone is qualified or not qualified based on subjective criteria rather than, actually sitting down and analyzing, giving it an analytical process. It's not like reviewing a resume is not like reviewing someone's math homework where, something is right or it's wrong. And biases can show up at any phase in a company's review process, even the computer phase where they're scanning, because computers can be programmed to filter out certain kinds of data, like they're looking for keywords to figure out if the applicant is male or female, and they could filter you out based on that. And I might introduce here that this is not something where you need to get, ill feelings towards people because of this, because a lot of it is subconsciously. They don't even realize what's going on, really, that they're getting these preconceived notions based on, something that they see on a piece of paper. So for most people, it's actually impossible to remain completely objective. And let me give you an example of this. Let's say you were in middle school and there was some boy there that had, any kind of name, George, for example. And I'm not picking that because I'm biased towards George's name. But if that individual was mean or sloppy or anything like that, that can give the name George a negative connotation. If you meet with a couple of friends and they say, hey, I got a new buddy I want you to meet, his name's George, you're going to right away have those same feelings applied to that person before you ever meet them. That kind of thing happens to all of us. And unfortunately, with a hiring manager or a recruiter, they're operating in the same mode. We're all human beings, so they're operating with those same perceptions, those same assumptions that can affect you or me. So expect that there is going to be a bias there, and you have to know how to deal with it, especially if you fall into the category, the kinds of things that we're going to talk about over the next few minutes here. If you fall into one of those categories, expect that there can be a bias, and I'm going to show you how to deal with it. Gender bias. This is one that's going to affect, everyone, really, because believe it or not, it can go both ways. And granted, this is something that from a legal perspective, companies can get in trouble for this. But it still happens because it's fairly easy to hide. And it is, sometimes, like I said, it is kind of low key. It's not like it's intentional. But stereotypes can disqualify you from even getting an interview. And a gender bias is one of the things that, can totally, it's just up to the supervisor. They look at your resume, and if they know, for example, that by your name you're a woman, and maybe the position that you're applying for supposedly requires masculine qualifications, maybe it's some type of management or supervision, something like that. A man, though, they can apply for a job that requires feminine qualifications, maybe as a nurse or something with communal involvement. The recruiter could determine, before they ever see your resume, that the type of person for this particular position needs to be a woman or it needs to be a man. Now, it's not fair, it's not right, but it's something that happens. You have to, I want to mention here, everything that I'm going to talk to you about is subjective. You don't have to do anything that I talk to you about here. It's totally up to you. But if, for example, you are applying for a job that you know is typically dominated by men or typically dominated by women, you need to be aware of that. And if you're willing and you want to make it easier for your, increase your potential, increase the possibility that you could get an interview, I'm going to show you how to deal with it. Stereotyping comes into play when, especially, let's say a supervisor has in mind what a woman is supposed to act like, what kinds of traits she's supposed to have. When she applies for a job that supervisor deems as male-oriented, then that puts a negative connotation on that applicant because the supervisor feels that the applicant is acting outside of, their little pattern, their stereotype. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes with certain jobs, gender is a relevant consideration, but most of the time, it's not. So how can we deal with it? Well, if you're applying for a gender-based job and you, like I said before, think that it could be an issue, one option for you, and I say option because you don't have to do it, but one option is to use your first initial instead of your first name. That way, you've eliminated pretty much the potential that they can determine which gender you are just by looking at your resume. Another thing you can do is avoid using titles like Mr. or Ms. And you can also consider lengthening your resume. Maybe you were only going to do a one-page resume. Go ahead and bump it to 2 pages, but use that extra space to show examples of your accomplishments, more recognitions or awards that you've received. So giving those extra examples of what your potential is can kind of counterbalance any types of bias that is there. For example, if you're applying as a male, applying for something that is predominantly filled by females, then you can show that you have had previous, experience in that position or in something related to it. Racial bias. Sometimes if you're a minority, then that can trigger some unfavorable assumptions on the part of the hiring manager. Now, don't get me wrong, we've come a long way with this, but it's still not a level playing field. On the other hand, it is possible for race to play a part if you're part of the racial majority. If you're of one race and the company has to fulfill certain obligations as far as percentages, then that could disqualify you. They might actually look for a certain ethnic group in order to fill that position. You might be asking, though, how in the world do they know my race based on the resume? Well, there are some things that are very obvious and some things that aren't. One of the things, though, that'll kind of trigger a flag there is the applicant's name. A lot of times, just by somebody's name, you can tell that maybe you can't tell specifically what race they are, but you can tell what races they're probably not. Your address can sometimes give that type of information away. Stereotypical opinions might kick in if you live in a certain part of town that people feel has some type of association with it. Where you got your education. Sometimes certain institutions are known for being minority institutions, and sometimes that can have a connotation that it offers a less valuable education. References. This is another issue where it may be difficult because of your specific situation. It might be difficult for you to secure the types of references that are going to help you get that better job. So these things are very real. The way that you deal with them, and I'm just going to offer you suggestions. These are the things that others have done to deal with these kinds of things. It might prompt people to maybe use Anglican versions of their names. They could do things like maybe if you're Hispanic, you could use the English translation of your name. So John for Juan, Mary for Maria. You might even condense your name if it's, something that's very revealing. Lou for Guadalupe. You could also use a P.O. box or the street address of a friend instead of your own mailing address. If you live in a part of town that you think is going to give you problems, you might also want to downplay any ethnic-specific education or jobs or affiliations, groups that you might be a member of. Again, if you feel that it's going to give you a problem. Now, I'm by no means saying, to try to hide who you are. That's not what we're going for here. In fact, if you try too much to do that, it can actually be counterproductive. But I'm just offering possible solutions, and I do have a word more to say on that towards the end of the video. Name bias. Applicants with warm names might be more inviting for certain types of jobs. So sometimes on our resume, we might actually want to put nicknames like Jim, Kathy, or Sam. That might be less suitable, though, if we're applying to a job that requires more competence, because those names can sound less competent. You might sound more sincere and friendly with those nicknames, but they're not as powerful as names like, the formal versions of the names. So Jim, Kathy, and Sam might better appear as James, Catherine, and Samuel. Even if you go by Jim, you might want to put James on your resume. Depends on the job you're applying for. So what you've got to do is choose whether to go with the less formal version or the more formal, again, suited to the specific job. Layout bias. Believe it or not, the layout of your resume is going to create an emotional reaction on the recruiter or the hiring manager. If it's long and wordy, then they're just going to sigh, and that's going to give them a bias that you're a boring person. They don't really care so much about the content at that point. If your text is clean and real easy to read, that's going to give you a point. So when you put your resume together, consider everything that we've talked about throughout this course. Use white space, simple fonts, bold text, use capital letters or underlining whenever you want to emphasize maybe a heading or something like that. And don't use symbols that aren't apparent on your keyboard, the symbols that actually show up on the keyboard. Now, I want to say this. I mentioned before that I had a little comment about all of this. It's very unfortunate to me that I have to present this topic. I'd like to imagine, at least, that it wouldn't be needful, in this day of modern enlightenment. But unfortunately, it still is. That's the reality, is that people still do have biases. And many of those biases operate on a subconscious level. So it's not directly their fault, it's just that it's something that happens. You're going to be the only one that decides how much you want to hide. I used to make recommendations as to whether people could become foster parents. And in determining whether they were or were not going to be recommended, I'd get to know them pretty good. And most of the time, there wasn't any kind of problem with making a recommendation. There's lots of really good people out there that are wanting to help raise children that need help. But once in a while, maybe there was an applicant that had been arrested for murder or convicted of welfare fraud, even arrested for child abuse. Those kinds of decisions, those were easy to make too. But there were some that were difficult. I struggled with them. The people seemed decent enough, but there was just something about them that gave me an uncomfortable feeling. And usually I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. Could those have been unfounded prejudices that were functioning on, a subconscious level? Or could they have even been something else? Who knows? But whatever was causing it, I wasn't about to leave my children in the care of those people. And I think it would be safe to say that to some degree, there is a little bit of prejudice in most of us, at least at some level, even if it's as simple as the explanation that I gave about George in the beginning. But what you've got to decide is how much of yourself you're willing to hide in your resume. A little bit of hiding might be necessary, so you can get yourself to that interview face to face and prove yourself. And if you do a little bit of hiding on your resume, that might be the only way you can accomplish that. Some of you, though, aren't going to do it because you feel like it's not being true to yourself. And that's okay. Just be aware that you might not get as many interviews for that specific reason. But you're the one that has to make that decision. Up next, we're going to explore resume myths.